I didn't build that wall to prove anything. I built it because I had to. After the first heavy rains hit the back slope of my property, I watched a sheet of earth slide dangerously close to my daughter's bedroom window. That was all I needed to see. I'd served 2 tours overseas, seen entire villages swallowed by mud when the land gave way. And I wasn't going to let that happen here, not in Fair Hollow Ridge, not in the house I worked 20 years to buy, not with my kid asleep inside. The retaining wall wasn't some grand construction, no concrete monstrosity or towering barrier. It was a modest, well-engineered timber and stone wall, built by licensed professionals I hired myself. It followed the local zoning codes and slope stability standards. I pulled the permit from the county, consulted a geotech, and even had a drainage system designed to reduce water pressure behind it. It was protective, not decorative, a line of defense. The first person to mention it was a neighbor named Marcy. She leaned over my fence while I was checking the slope behind the wall, coffee mug in hand. "Hey, I didn't know you were building something back here," she said, squinting. "You clear that with the HOA. I gave her a nod. "County permit. It's safety work." "Mm-hmm." She sipped her drink like she didn't believe me and walked off. I knew how this neighborhood worked. Everyone smiled at your face and reported you behind your back. But I didn't expect what came next. Exactly 3 days after the final inspection on the wall, I got the letter. It was printed on the thick, smug kind of paper that only HOA boards seem to love. Bolded subject line Times New Roman font language full of pretend concern. Unapproved construction violation of architectural guidelines, subject to daily fines. They said my retaining wall hadn't been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. That it violated visual harmony standards. That I was in breach of Section 8.3b of the HOA CC&Rs, some nonsense about exterior modifications without board approval. I called the number at the bottom. The woman who answered said someone from the board would get back to me. No one did. But someone else did show up, Karen. Her real name was Karen Walters, and if there was ever a person who lived up to the name, it was her. Platinum hair, matching tennis outfit, voice that sounded like sweet tea laced with venom. She didn't knock. She rang the doorbell twice hard and stood like she owned the place, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other. "I'm from the HOA board," she said. "Vice President. I need to speak with you about the retaining wall." I stepped out and closed the door behind me. "Afraid I can't let you inspect anything back there," I said. "It's private property. You'd need permission or a warrant." Her smile didn't budge. "Oh, this isn't a legal matter. Not yet. We just need to make sure the wall doesn't pose a threat to community aesthetics or drainage conformity." I paused. "The wall is legal. I have a permit from the city signed by a structural engineer and stamped by the Slope Assessment Office." She actually scoffed. "The city doesn't dictate the HOA standards. We do." And there it was. The first real crack in the wall wasn't in the structure, it was in the system. This HOA wasn't interested in safety. It was interested in control. She handed me a pink slip of paper. "You'll receive daily fines until the structure is removed or formally approved." "I'll be appealing that," I said flatly. Karen's eyes sparkled like she couldn't wait. "Then I suggest you brush up on the CC&Rs. You'll need every clause." She turned, walked down my path without another word. I watched her heels click away on my concrete, the same path I'd poured with my own hands after moving in. The same walk my daughter rode her trike on just last week. I stood in the doorway for a long time after she left. This wasn't about a wall anymore. This was about territory. The next day, I walked back along the edge of the slope, tracing the contours of the structure with my eyes. The retaining wall was exactly where it needed to be. Every footing was measured and leveled, every drainage pipe placed according to code. It didn't block anyone's view. It didn't encroach on any shared land. It was defensive, not invasive. But it was visible from Karen's second-floor deck, I realized. Just enough that it must have irked her like a scar on her precious suburban canvas. And in neighborhoods like ours, the wrong kind of scar could get you exiled. By the weekend, the HOA sent a second notice, this one with a fine breakdown. $150 per day, retroactive to the day I violated. They also informed me that non-compliance could result in lien placement against my property. I stood in my garage reading that letter, my hands shaking not with fear but fury. They wanted me to bow. They wanted me to bend to an unelected group of neighbors who thought their preferences were more important than safety science or common sense. Well, I didn't bend. I built that wall to stop a landslide. But now I realized I was going to need it for something else too. To hold the line. If the first visit from Karen was just a warning shot, the next few weeks felt like a siege. It started subtly. A note taped to my mailbox, folded neatly unsigned, but clearly typed by someone with a firm grasp of HOA legalese. It cited 4 different sections of the Fair Hollow Ridge covenants, conditions, and restrictions, highlighting my supposed failure to submit an architectural change request prior to the construction of a retaining structure exceeding 24 inches in height. I measured my wall. It was 36, just over, just enough to trigger their wrath. Then came the compliance inspection. Not by a licensed professional, but by Karen herself and 2 board members I'd never met, Dennis, a retiree who wore a blazer over a golf shirt, and Lynn, who always looked like she was holding in a scream. They showed up unannounced on a Tuesday morning while I was making breakfast for my daughter, Sophie. I saw them through the window, walking straight up my driveway, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning like they were appraising damage from a tornado. I stepped outside before they reached the fence. "This is private property," I said. "I didn't authorize any inspection." "We're not inside your house," Karen said sweetly. "We're simply observing what's visible from the street and common areas." "There's no common area behind my garage," I said flatly. "Your side slope is visible from the adjacent path," Dennis piped up, pointing to a narrow gravel maintenance trail on the other side of my lot line. "That gives us jurisdiction to evaluate for visual and structural compliance." I had half a mind to call the sheriff right then and there. But I didn't want Sophie, who was watching from the window, to see that. Not yet. Instead, I crossed my arms. "You'll be hearing from my attorney." Karen smiled like she'd just won a round. "I hope so," she said. "We love when homeowners get legal. It clarifies things for everyone." By the end of that week, I'd received an official packet from the HOA containing a formal notice of noncompliance, a $150 fine, and an order to remediate, giving me 14 days to dismantle the wall. They had gone from passive-aggressive to full-on authoritarian. I started reading every page of the CC&Rs like they were war orders. I dug up every architectural guideline they'd published since 2002. And that's when I found something interesting. There was a clause buried deep in the emergency modifications section that allowed for immediate structural additions to mitigate documented geological instability, provided a certified geotechnical engineer deemed them necessary. I had exactly that. From a firm called Dwyer and Holcomb, dated 3 weeks before construction. It clearly described the hillside behind my house as subject to seasonal soil creep and moderate landslide risk. That clause meant I didn't need HOA approval for the wall. I had county clearance and expert justification. I scanned the document, printed multiple copies, and mailed them certified to the HOA office and the board president, a man named Everett Burke. He never responded. Karen did. She sent me an email titled, "Response to Mitigation Claim." I'll never forget the smugness in those few lines. "Thank you for your submission. While your documentation may justify action under county guidelines, it does not override the HOA's responsibility to maintain visual uniformity and safety for all members. Your retaining wall remains in violation until the board votes otherwise. We recommend immediate removal." I stared at the screen pulse in my ears. It was like arguing with a wall thicker than the one I'd built. No acknowledgement of the engineering risk. No consideration for safety, just aesthetics. Visual uniformity. That was their god. And still it escalated. Dennis, who barely spoke during the first visit, filed a report claiming that runoff from my wall's drain pipe might endanger the integrity of the HOA-maintained walking path 20 feet away. A baseless claim, but it gave Karen more ammunition. She attached the complaint to a new violation, tacking on another $450 fine for drainage irregularity. Then came the worst part, the newsletter. Fair Hollow Ridge sent out a monthly printed newsletter, The Ridge View, and in that month's issue, the board published a community safety notice about unauthorized modifications to slopeside properties and how these may pose a threat to adjacent homes. It didn't name me, but everyone knew. I walked into the local hardware store that weekend, and the clerk who used to call me captain for my military days wouldn't meet my eyes. A neighbor I used to chat with at the mailbox started crossing the street. Kids stopped biking past our house like we were radioactive. Karen had turned me into a pariah, a rule breaker, a threat. Sophie noticed. "Daddy, why does Mrs. Walters hate our backyard?" I didn't know how to answer that in words a 9-year-old could process. So I crouched down, held her hands, and told her the only truth I could. Because people are scared of what they don't understand, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean they're right. And I meant it. But the truth was, I was tired. Tired of the fines. Tired of the whispers. Tired of standing alone with nothing but concrete timber and a permit no one respected. I looked at the wall every night before bed. I'd run my hand across its edge, check for signs of shifting or watermarks. Listen to the faint gurgle of the drainage pipe doing its job. It never failed me. It just stood there, strong, silent, unfazed by the noise around it. That wall didn't ask for praise. It asked for trust, just like I had once. And now, it wasn't just holding back the earth. It was holding back the full weight of a neighborhood trying to bury me. They didn't know it yet, but they'd picked a fight with the wrong man. The first lien notice arrived on a Monday. I had just gotten back from dropping Sophie off at school, her little purple backpack still sitting in the passenger seat, when I opened the mailbox and saw the envelope. It wasn't even sealed right. The HOA logo was barely aligned, the address printed crooked like even the printer was tired of this nonsense. Inside was a final warning. They claimed I owed $450 in accrued fines, that my refusal to dismantle the retaining wall constituted ongoing defiance of HOA policy, that unless I complied within 10 days, they would initiate lien proceedings to secure the debt against my property. I read the words twice, then a third time. I knew what a lien meant. I'd done enough estate planning after my wife passed to understand the power of one. They weren't just trying to punish me. They were threatening to take my home. I sat down on the front step with that letter in hand and stared at the gravel path winding past the houses. Just beyond it, I could see the top edge of the wall, solid and patient, like always doing its job while I fought a battle it never asked to be part of. The same day, I got an email from a lawyer someone hired by the HOA. Her name was Dana Hartridge, and her tone was robotic. "Dear Mr. Callahan, we represent the Fair Hollow Ridge Homeowners Association in the matter of ongoing violations of architectural standards and unauthorized slope modifications. You are hereby ordered to cease and desist any and all maintenance or alterations to the retaining wall in question. Failure to comply will result in legal action, including but not limited to injunctive relief collection proceedings and potential forced demolition, with costs borne by the homeowner." I read that email 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was strategic, bureaucratic warfare. They weren't just going to slap fines on me until I gave up. They were going to choke me with paperwork, bury me under procedure, hope that I'd be too broke or broken to fight back. But they'd underestimated one thing. I'd been through worse. I'd stood in courtrooms with soldiers' families and explained why a casket came home early. I'd faced storms in places that had no roads or warnings. Paper threats didn't scare me. And I had something HOA Karen and her little cohort didn't evidence. I called my lawyer Marla Dupree, a no-nonsense litigator who'd handled property disputes for veterans like me before. We met over coffee the next morning, and I laid everything on the table: permits, engineering reports, timelines, even photos of the slope before and after construction. She flipped through it all with raised eyebrows. "This is airtight," she said. "You followed code. You have expert sign-off, county approval. They're bluffing." I nodded, but they're bluffing hard. Marla looked up. "We can file a preemptive motion, get a declaratory judgment, ask the court to affirm the legality of the wall and freeze their lien threat. If they go after you with a lien before that, we counter with a stay and sue for harassment." "Let's do it," I said. And just like that, the rules changed. We filed within 48 hours. I had to write a personal declaration, 7 pages, describing everything. The rainfall that first exposed the slope weakness, the cost of construction, the harassment from the board. Writing it was harder than I expected, not because I didn't know what to say, but because it forced me to relive every moment of helplessness I thought I'd buried. When the papers were served to the HOA's legal team, Karen reacted the only way she knew how, publicly. A week later at the community board meeting, normally a sleepy affair with 10 people, and free cookies, Karen arrived in full armor. Hair blown out, manicured nails tapping the podium. A slide deck behind her titled "Threats to Fair Hollow Ridge Homeowner Non-Compliance." She didn't say my name, but she might as well have tattooed it across the projector screen. Some individuals, she began, believe that personal judgment overrides the standards we all agreed to when we joined this community. But when those actions put others at risk visually, environmentally, legally, we must act. She clicked to the next slide, a blurry photo of my retaining wall taken from God knows where. This structure, she said, voice tightening, was built without HOA approval. Despite a permit from the county, it fails to comply with our design review protocol. And now this homeowner has taken legal action against all of you, wasting community funds to fight a battle of his own making. I stood in the back of the room, calm, watching. When she finished, someone actually clapped. I didn't know who. But then something shifted. A hand went up. Mrs. Gonzalez, who lived 2 streets over. Her husband was disabled. She never spoke at meetings. Did the county approve the wall, she asked. Karen blinked. Yes, but... And is the homeowner's property at risk without it? Karen's lips curled. That's not the issue. The issue is another hand, then another. What if we get rains like last year? Did anyone even go look at the slope? Why are we spending money on lawsuits when the wall might actually help? Karen's face stiffened. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My wall was doing it for me, brick by brick, truth standing against theater. By the end of the meeting, the board didn't reverse their position, but they hesitated. And hesitation meant fear. I went home that night feeling something shift in the wind. The ground wasn't moving yet, but the pressure was building. You could feel it in the way the clouds hung heavier, the way neighbors looked just a little longer before glancing away. The wall still stood, the fines still came, but I had drawn a line. They thought they were burying me in paper. They forgot I knew how to fight from underneath. By the end of September, the air in Fair Hollow Ridge felt heavier, not just because the storms were coming, but because something fundamental had cracked beneath the polished surface of our neighborhood. It wasn't just about a wall anymore. It was about the story that wall told, and the ones Karen and her board were desperate to erase. They wanted control. I wanted the truth. And the truth was, I had followed the law. I had acted in defense of my property and my child, and I had the paperwork to prove it. So I got organized. Military training doesn't leave you. It reshapes the way you think. Chain of command. Documentation. Discipline under pressure. I built a war file 3-ring binder, color-coded tabs labeled exhibits. Every permit, every email, every inspection report, and engineering note. I compiled drone footage from before and after the wall's construction, showing the erosion patterns and how my build had stabilized the slope. I pulled rainfall data from NOAA, matched it to the drainage system I installed, and included the blueprints with flow calculations highlighted. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I was taking this fight to the next level. Marla filed an amended complaint with the court, not just a request for declaratory judgment, but a claim of bad faith enforcement. A term that, legally speaking, accused the HOA of targeting me without cause, while ignoring actual risks in the community. That made the board nervous. They had to file a response, and their lawyer's rebuttal was paper thin. They claimed my wall created aesthetically disharmonious lines that disrupt the natural continuity of the hillside. No mention of safety. No engineering review to counter mine. Just more subjective nonsense wrapped in legal tone. So I made a move. They didn't expect I sent my entire file to the local news. Not a big network, just a small investigative desk at Channel 8. The reporter Hannah Lynn called me the same day she opened the file. I could hear the buzz in her voice. You're telling me the HOA is trying to demolish a retaining wall that was professionally engineered right before the rainy season? That's right, I said. And it protects your home from documented landslide risk. Correct. She paused. And you're a veteran. Army Corps of Engineers. 2 tours. Honorable discharge. There was another pause. I'll be in Fair Hollow Ridge on Friday. Friday came with gray skies and the smell of rain hanging low. Hannah showed up with a camera crew and a windbreaker, heels swapped for boots. I gave her the full walkthrough, showed her the permits, the slope, the wall itself. She nodded along, asking sharp questions. But what caught her attention most was the proximity. How close the back of Karen's property sat to mine. How her house was directly downslope from the wooded section above the retaining wall. And if this wall wasn't here, she asked. I pointed to the gully beside it. Water would pool, erode the slope, and flow downslope straight toward her patio. The soil here is sandy loam. It moves fast when saturated. The geotech report even included a slope failure model for that exact scenario. Karen refused to give a statement for the piece, so did the board, but the story aired that weekend. HOA versus safety. The wall that might save a neighborhood. My phone lit up. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in weeks came knocking. One man, Ben Rodriguez, an EMT who lived 4 doors down, shook my hand and said, "If my place sat where yours does, I'd have built it twice as tall." But Karen didn't retreat. She doubled down. The next HOA bulletin accused me of media manipulation and creating panic for personal gain. They called the wall unauthorized, unapproved, unwanted. They still refused to acknowledge the county permit. So I made another move. I sent my file plus the news clip to the HOA City Planning and Environmental Safety Department. 2 weeks later, they sent an inspector. He arrived in a city truck with a clipboard and a badge, introduced himself as Victor Lang. He was quiet, meticulous, took soil samples, walked the perimeter, checked the runoff channels I'd installed, measured the slope angle, photographed the existing vegetation. I watched from the deck, heart pounding. An hour later, he approached me with a neutral expression. "Mind if I ask who designed this system?" "Dwyer and Holcomb," I said. I also made some layout decisions based on course of engineers' landslide protocols. I was a combat engineer. He nodded slowly. "Well, whoever did this, they knew what they were doing. That wall is textbook slope mitigation, proper setback, excellent weep hole placement, drainage is functional. You even armored the lower channel with riprap. Most folks wouldn't have thought to do that." I said nothing. My throat had gone tight. "I'll be writing a recommendation that this wall remain as is. If the HOA continues to push for demolition, they'll have to explain to the city why they want to remove a functional safety barrier with documented necessity." He gave me a faint smile. "Don't think they'll win that argument." I nodded slowly. "Thank you." When he left, I sat in the garage, same place where I first read their fine notice, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Not just over the fight, but over the fear. That wall was more than wood and rock and concrete. It was the one thing I'd built since losing my wife that I knew was protecting the one thing I had left, Sophie. They could call it a violation. They could fine me, threaten me, ostracize me. But that wall wasn't just holding back the hillside. It was holding back everything they tried to bury me with. And the rains hadn't even come yet. I should have known Karen wasn't done. When someone like her feels cornered not by threats, but by truth, they don't back off. They escalate, and they get sloppy. It started with the dead patch of grass behind the retaining wall. At first, I thought it was just runoff from the edge of the slope. But when I walked down to inspect it, I saw something else. My drain pipe had been twisted. The elbow joint connecting it to the outflow trench had been moved. Not by weather, but by hand. There were fingerprints in the clay. Fresh ones. I didn't want to believe it. I really didn't. But the camera footage confirmed what I feared. I'd installed a motion-activated trail cam back in June mounted behind the utility shed just above the wall. Mostly to monitor wildlife. We had raccoons, coyotes, and even the occasional bobcat wandering the slope. But on Thursday night around 11:24 p.m., the cam had captured a human silhouette stepping over my back fence with a flashlight. A tall, thin woman in a windbreaker, her hair tied up in a bun. She wore gloves and carried a phone in one hand. The flashlight beam jittered as she moved across the slope, stopping near the base of the wall. There she crouched, and though the footage wasn't perfect, I could see her grip the pipe and pull. She stayed there for nearly 4 minutes. I stared at the footage for a long time, my jaw locked, blood roaring in my ears. Then I zoomed in on a single frame, just before she turned to leave. There it was, the faint, unmistakable glint of a gold HOA name badge pinned to her jacket. Karen. She had crossed the line. This wasn't board politics anymore. This was criminal trespassing, and more than that, tampering with a permitted structure designed to prevent slope failure. In the eyes of the county, that could qualify as public endangerment. I printed the still image, emailed the full video to myself, and called Marla. She didn't hesitate. We pressed charges. "I don't want to escalate," I said, even as I heard my own voice shaking. Marla's voice sharpened. "She entered your property, without consent sabotaged a structural safety feature, And you have evidence. If you let this go, you're opening the door for them to go even further. This is how bullies operate. They test the boundaries. The minute you don't reinforce them, they push harder. She was right. So I filed a police report. The deputy who came to take my statement, Officer Reynolds, was younger than I expected, but sharp. He watched the footage 3 times, taking notes, nodding. We've had other complaints about this HOA, he muttered. Mostly nuisance stuff, noise complaints, citation disputes, but this is different. Will you arrest her? He shook his head. Not yet. But we'll open an investigation. We'll call her in for questioning. If she admits it or we find corroborating evidence like fingerprints or matching shoe prints, we'll forward it to the DA. It wasn't immediate justice, but it was something. That weekend, I noticed a shift in Karen. She didn't come down the block anymore. Didn't patrol the walking trail like she used to. At Sunday's board meeting, she stayed unusually quiet, letting Dennis take the lead while she scrolled her phone face, tense lips pressed thin. I watched from the back of the room, waiting for her to meet my eyes. She didn't. But it wasn't just guilt I was sensing. It was fear, because the truth was out there now. I had the video. The police had a report, and though the HOA still hadn't lifted their fines, I could feel the board's posture changing small signs. Fewer emails, less aggressive letters. The tone went from authoritarian to cautiously diplomatic. That Monday, I got a knock on my door. It was Everett Burke, the HOA president. I'd never seen him in person. He was older than I expected, with silver hair, a pressed collared shirt, and the look of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. I'd like to speak privately, if I may, he said. We sat on the porch. He didn't touch his coffee. I wasn't aware of everything that's been going on, he said carefully. Not in full detail. I didn't reply. I let silence do the heavy lifting. I saw the footage, he said. We have procedures. If a board member violates them, especially trespassing, there are consequences. And the fines, I asked. He hesitated. If the wall is declared legal under state statute and city code, then we can't enforce penalties. But the vote to formally rescind the fines has to come from the board. And Karen, we're reviewing her status. That's when I realized something critical. Everett wasn't here to apologize. He was here to contain fallout. Karen had gone rogue, and now she was a liability. He wanted my silence. No escalation, no lawsuit. Just a quiet resolution so the HOA wouldn't become the next headline on Channel 8. But I wasn't interested in retribution. I wanted protection for me, for Sophie, for the neighbors who didn't have the resources or stubbornness to fight like I had. You want this to go away? I asked. Then here's what I need. I laid it out plainly. All fines dropped immediately. Written acknowledgement that the retaining wall was legally constructed and permitted. HOA policy updated to include a clear clause respecting county-approved emergency structures. And Karen removed from the board permanently. Everett blinked. That's a lot. It's reasonable, I said. And if you don't agree, I'll forward the footage to every resident in this neighborhood, along with the police report. He didn't respond right away. But I saw it in his eyes, the calculation. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of what I represented. A resident who knew his rights and had the receipts. I'll bring it to the board, he said quietly. He left without shaking my hand. That night, as rain began tapping against the windows, I stood by the back fence and looked down at the slope. The wall gleamed under the porch light, wet but unwavering. And I realized something strange. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt ready. Because the ground was shifting beneath the slope, yes, but also beneath the entire neighborhood. And the next storm was coming fast. The warnings came in waves, just like the storm would. On a Thursday morning in late October, the National Weather Service issued an extreme rainfall and landslide watch for our county. They called it an atmospheric river event, the kind of storm system that drags in water from the Pacific and dumps it over the foothills, like someone slashing open a fire hose. By noon, the city's emergency alert system sent a push notification to every phone in Fair Hollow Ridge. I saw the glow light up Sophie's iPad across the kitchen. As I read the same alert on mine, expect up to 7 inches of rain in 36 hours. Prepare for slope instability. Avoid unnecessary travel. My gut clenched. I walked out onto the deck. The sky was already bruising over with clouds low, heavy, moving fast. The wind had that electric bite to it, the kind you learn to read when you've spent time in flood zones. I looked down at the slope at the brush clinging to the loose earth behind our homes. And I thought about Karen's house just 2 properties over, built directly downhill from the most unstable portion of the hillside. They weren't ready. None of them were. But my wall was. I ran a systems check that afternoon just like I'd done before every deployment. Drainage pipes clear. Gravel channel dry, stable reinforced with added riprap I'd shoveled in the week prior. Wooden braces tight. Foundation anchor plates 0 shift. The wall stood strong like a soldier in formation waiting for impact. At 5:47 p.m., the rain started. By 7:00 it was pounding. Sophie and I sat on the couch, her curled into my side, the lights flickering occasionally as the storm bore down. I'd already moved our emergency supplies into the downstairs closet: flashlights, blankets, bottled water, and old military radio I never got rid of. I'd seen what storms could do to a slope like ours, and I wasn't going to take any chances. Around 9:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was my neighbor Ben, the EMT. "You seeing this?" he said, voice tight. "I've got water flooding my back patio, and there's movement on the upper trail. Trees shifting. Fast. Get your family downstairs," I told him. "I'll come check it." I threw on my jacket boots, headlamp. Sophie didn't want me to go, but I kissed her forehead and said 5 minutes, just making sure no one's in danger. Outside, the world was soaked. Sheets of water pounded the street, pooling at the curbs. My boots splashed through muddy puddles as I jogged toward the trail that wrapped behind the upper row of houses. And that's when I saw it. The slope was starting to bleed, thin ribbons of mud, running like veins down the hillside. Roots were exposed, rocks had shifted, and near the upper quadrant where Karen's house sat perched behind an unfortified grade, the earth was sagging. Slowly. Quietly. Like a breath being held too long. I took out my phone and called it in first to the city's emergency services, then to the HOA emergency line. The latter went to voicemail. Then I turned toward the trail eyes, scanning through the downpour, and saw movement. It was Karen. She was standing at the edge of her patio in a raincoat, yelling into her phone. Her lights were still on. I could hear the panic in her voice, even over the storm. "There's water coming from the slope. I don't know where it's rushing toward the deck." I cupped my hands and shouted, "Karen, get inside now." She looked at me like I was the rain itself, sudden unwanted blinding. Then I heard it. A low rumble, muffled but growing. And the slope gave way. A section of hillside above her house, at least 15 feet wide, collapsed. A mass of mud roots, rocks, and water surged forward, like a tidal wave of earth barreling downslope in seconds. I shouted go, but she was frozen. And then, the wall caught it. Like a dam halting a flood, the retaining wall took the full force of the mudslide. The crash echoed like thunder, shaking the ground. Earth slammed into the timber face, rising 3 feet 4, then 5, as debris piled against the structure. But it held. My wall held. The flow redirected exactly as the engineering plans said it would, channeling the slide into the gravel trench and around the outer curve of the property. Water poured through the drain pipes, spraying from the outflow in a torrent. My riprap trench funneled it safely down into the culvert below. Karen's house, though spattered with mud, was untouched. She stood there, mouth open, eyes wide, drenched in disbelief. I walked up to the fence line, heart pounding. "That's the wall you tried to demolish," I said, breath fogging the air. "It just saved your life." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Behind me, neighbors began to gather flashlights, bobbing voices rising, phones recording. Someone gasped. Someone else cried out, "Holy hell." Even Ben showed up shouting, "That wall stopped a goddamn landslide." People circled around the edge of my property, eyes tracing the path of destruction, trees ripped from their roots. Fences shattered, but the homes spared. And in the middle of it all, my retaining wall cracked, dented, bowed from impact, but still standing. It was more than wood and stone. It was proof. And for the first time in months, I saw Karen look at it not with contempt, but with something closer to reverence and shame. The rain kept falling, but the damage had been stopped. Because I had built something strong, stronger than fear, stronger than the HOA, and far stronger than the lies they told themselves about visual harmony. It wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. And in that moment, everyone finally saw the difference. By 2:45 a.m., the storm had turned biblical. I hadn't slept. Neither had Sophie, though I kept her curled on the couch, tucked into the old army sleeping bag I used on deployment. She asked me once in a drowsy voice, "Is it like this when the sky breaks?" And I told her yes. Because that's what it felt like the sky was breaking open and trying to wash us off the map. The gutters had long since overflowed. Street drains turned to geysers. Tree branches whipped in the wind like snapped cables. The power flickered twice, then went out entirely. And still the wall held. I sat by the window boots, still on headlamp-charged flashlight beside me, phone on low brightness, and vibrating with alert after alert. Flood advisory. Evacuation warning. Possible mudslide near Ridgeview Path. That was us. That was our street. At 3:08 a.m., the ground shifted. Truly shifted. Not like the light slides I'd seen earlier in the evening. This wasn't trickling runoff. This was the hillside giving up. It began with a cracking sound, low resonant, almost like ice breaking under a lake. I sprang up from the window and ran toward the back deck, flinging open the sliding door. And there it was. The hill was moving. A 50-foot wide chunk of the upper slope had detached. Trees didn't fall, they slid. Roots still tangled in the rushing wave of earth. I watched entire fence panels surf down a slurry of mud boulders and timber. The roar of it was deafening, like an avalanche in slow motion. And it was heading straight for my wall. I ran downstairs, grabbed Sophie, and carried her into the central hallway, the safest part of the house. I wrapped her in my arms, kneeling against the interior wall as the ground outside trembled with the force of impact. Boom! The whole house shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. A picture frame slammed to the floor. Sophie let out a scream, but I held her tighter. "It's okay," I whispered. "It's okay. That's just the wall. It's doing its job." I didn't believe it. Not entirely. I waited for the sound of tearing, of splintering timber, of the back half of the house giving way. But it didn't come. After what felt like an eternity, I stood and grabbed the flashlight. I opened the front door and stepped out into the storm. Rain lashed my face. The wind cut across the street like a blade. But the wall, my wall, was still there. The mud had slammed into it with full force, rising nearly to the top in a massive surge of sludge and debris. The bottom braces were soaked, bowed inward, but not broken. The French drain was pouring out water in torrents exactly as designed. The riprap trench behind it was overwhelmed, but still guiding water downslope away from the foundations of the homes. And above it all stood the line, a scar across the hillside where the mudslide had stopped. Not because the storm relented, because the wall refused to let it pass. Karen's house, just behind the slide zone, had avoided destruction by a matter of feet. Her deck was coated in mud. One of her potted trees had vanished. But the structure itself intact, untouched, saved. Neighbors began to pour outside flashlights, swinging like searchlights across a war zone. I heard gasps, exclamations, someone yelling, "Oh my God, he was right." A man ran past in a panic, shouting something about his crawl space flooding. Another woman wrapped in a robe and drenched to the knees grabbed my arm. "You saved all of us." I didn't answer. I just stared at the wall. I couldn't look away. I expected Karen to stay inside, hide behind her blinds like she always did when things didn't go her way. But then I saw her. She walked down the path behind her house, flashlight shaking in her hand. Her raincoat hung limp, her face pale. She stepped carefully, almost reverently, toward the edge of the retaining wall where the mud had piled 6 feet high, and she looked at it. Really looked. I watched her lips move, but I couldn't hear what she said. Maybe it was thank you. Maybe it was sorry. Maybe it was nothing at all. She didn't come any closer, just stood there for a minute or two. Then turned and walked back into her house, her porch light flickering above her like a spotlight trying to keep her in view. By 5 a.m., emergency crews had arrived. The fire department, 2 sheriff's cruisers, and a city engineer in a soaked, reflective vest. They declared a level 2 landslide incident, evacuated 2 homes further up the slope, took photos of the retaining wall from every angle. One of them, a structural specialist, walked up to me and said, "If that wall wasn't here..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. As dawn began to break gray and grim and soaked, I finally let Sophie fall asleep in my arms, her breathing slow, steady. I sat on the couch, eyes still on the rain-streaked window, and thought about everything they had thrown at me. Fines, threats, legal letters, shame, isolation. And yet, it was that very wall, the one they tried to erase, that now stood between the community and devastation. It didn't matter if they apologized. It didn't matter if they ever admitted they were wrong, because they knew. And I had built something that would outlast their denial. Something that didn't need permission to exist. Just purpose. At sunrise, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The streets were caked in thick layers of wet silt. Garbage cans floated at odd angles, wedged between curbs and mailboxes. Broken branches and splintered fence posts jutted from the mud like the ribs of something half-buried and ancient. A fire truck idled on the corner, its lights spinning lazily in the mist, casting a red pulse across the soaked chaos. And in the middle of it all stood my retaining wall, scarred, stained, and victorious. But the most surreal sight was Karen's house. From the street, it looked almost untouched. Her windows were unbroken. Her porch light, still blinking from the night before, cast a ghostly glow over the patio. But the real story was out back. I walked the perimeter of the property that morning, boots sinking into the slush with every step, and peered through the narrow gap in the fence line that separated our lots. What I saw froze me. The slide had come within inches of her foundation. A dense wall of mud, still steaming in the early cold, had piled high against the very structure she'd called a visual violation just weeks before. Her patio furniture was gone, swept away by the wave. One of her garden trellises was crumpled beneath the muck. But the house itself, its walls, its doors, its fragile suburban perfection, remained intact, because my wall had held. It had taken the brunt of the collapse and redirected it like the blueprint had promised. The French drain system rerouted the water. The angled buttresses absorbed the impact. Everything worked as it was meant to, and the wall she had tried to have destroyed had saved her. I didn't see Karen again that morning. She didn't come outside. Her blinds stayed shut. Her porch, usually swept clean and decorated with seasonal wreaths, was caked in a thin layer of grime, as if even the rain had tried to mark it. But the silence that was loud. Neighbors came out in waves throughout the day. Most of them wore boots and pajamas, holding mugs or phones or both. They walked up to me, not with suspicion, but with relief, gratitude, respect. Ben, the EMT, shook my hand. You bought us time. That wall, man. I don't even want to think what would have happened without it. Mrs. Gonzalez, who had once been quiet during those HOA meetings, hugged me so tightly I had to brace my back. You stood your ground, she whispered. You knew. And you fought for us even when they turned on you. Even Dennis, the board member, who had co-signed Karen's complaints, approached me midday with a sheepish expression. We misjudged the situation, he said, eyes low. That's one way to put it, I said. He swallowed hard. Karen won't be returning to the board. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I just nodded and turned away. Because this wasn't a moment for victory, it was a moment for truth. And the truth was, I hadn't built that wall to prove anything. I built it to protect. That night, the city sent out geologists and structural engineers. They studied the hillside, mapped the flow of the mud, and documented how the retaining wall had altered its course. One of them, a younger woman named Sasha, approached me while taking notes. Did you say this was built before the storm? 5 months ago, I said. Permitted. Engineered. They tried to make me tear it down. She blinked. Why? HOA said it was a violation. She looked at the wall, then back at me. It's the only thing that didn't fail. By the end of the next week, the city published a preliminary report. It confirmed what everyone already knew. The retaining structure at 4241 West Ridgeview, constructed per geotechnical and engineering best practices, significantly reduced the impact of the landslide event. Damage to property's downslope would have likely been catastrophic had the structure not been present. That was the official language, but the community translated it loud and clear. Karen's war was over, and her silence became its own confession. Days passed. The mud began to dry. Cleanup crews moved in. The HOA stayed eerily quiet. No fines, no letters, no newsletters. Until one showed up. A new bulletin. No photos, no colors. Just one paragraph on white paper slipped into every mailbox on the street. Effective immediately, Karen Walters has resigned from the Fair Hollow Ridge HOA board. We thank her for her service and wish her well in future endeavors. There was no apology, no acknowledgement. But they didn't need to write it. Everyone knew what had happened. Sophie and I stood outside that afternoon, raking out the mud from the edge of our back fence, when she asked, "Is it over?" I looked up at the slope, at the battered but unbroken wall, at the tree roots poking from the hillside, at the line where disaster had been stopped by preparation. Almost, I said. And in the distance, I saw Karen step onto her back porch. She didn't say anything, just looked down at the wall. We locked eyes for a moment, two people who had fought a silent war, one with rules and fines, the other with timber and stone. And I saw it. In her face. Not just the shame, but understanding. She finally knew what I had known all along, that a rulebook doesn't stop nature, and a title doesn't make you right. Only truth does. Only action does. And in the end, the wall she tried to tear down had become her savior. The community center was packed. It was the first HOA meeting since the storm, and for once, every chair was filled. People stood against the walls, some still in work boots and windbreakers, others clasping clipboards or phones ready to record. The folding tables, usually stacked with pastries and weak coffee, had been cleared to make space for news crews and city officials. A Channel 8 camera crew was already set up in the back corner. Hannah Lynn, the same reporter who first broke the story about my wall, was seated beside them with a notebook in her lap. I stood at the front of the room just behind the microphone stand. The HOA board sat to my right like a shrunken tribunal, Dennis looking pale and stiff, Lynn avoiding eye contact, and Everett Burke sitting dead center with the stoicism of a man who knew there was no script left to follow. The chair that used to belong to Karen was empty. It had been announced in the bulletin 2 days prior she had formally resigned. No ceremony, no tribute, just an administrative erasure. But you could still feel her presence in the room like static clinging to the air. I cleared my throat and began. My name is Caleb Callahan. I live at 4241 West Ridgeview. Most of you know me as the guy who built the wall. A ripple of chuckles moved through the audience, but I didn't smile. Not yet. I'd like to thank everyone who showed up today. And I'd like to begin by doing what the board never did, tell the full truth. I reached into my folder and pulled out the city's official landslide report. This is the structural damage and mitigation assessment published by the City Planning and Environmental Safety Department. It includes before and after topography hydrology flowcharts and an analysis of how my retaining wall redirected the mudslide that hit our neighborhood at 3:08 a.m. last Friday. I held it up for everyone to see. It also confirms that had the wall not been there, at least 2 properties, one of them belonging to a member of this very board, would have sustained catastrophic damage. I didn't have to say Karen's name. Everyone already knew. I turned toward Everett. You called my wall a visual disruption. You said it was non-compliant. You sent fines. You threatened liens. Your board tried to destroy the only thing that actually protected this community when it mattered. Everett stared straight ahead, unmoving, unblinking. I continued. I followed every code. I pulled a city permit, hired a certified geotech, filed the engineering plans. But none of that mattered because this board believed its authority trumped safety. Your priorities were cosmetic, bureaucratic, and reckless. Murmurs filled the room. One neighbor, Ben, the EMT, clapped once loud, then twice. A few others followed. I held up the next paper. This is the cease and desist order your attorney sent me claiming I was endangering the community by refusing to dismantle a structure designed to prevent. Exactly what just occurred. Then came the final document. And this is the police report I filed the night your former vice president trespassed onto my property and sabotaged my drainage system. I have video footage. I've already submitted it to authorities. Lynn audibly gasped. Dennis shrank lower in his seat. Someone behind me muttered, Jesus. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone, I said, my voice steady now. But I will not let this moment pass without accountability. Because too many people could have lost everything, and not from a storm, from arrogance. I stepped back and let the silence expand. No one on the board moved. Everett finally leaned forward, the mic picking up the shift in his breath. Mr. Callahan, he began, voice dry. We recognize the extraordinary circumstances of this event, and we appreciate your role in... I cut in. No. He blinked. No more statements, no more hedging, just tell the truth. He glanced around, saw the eyes on him. The cameras, the residents, the reporter, even the city officials sitting along the wall. His jaw worked. Then finally, he spoke. We were wrong. 3 words. That's all. But the room reacted like a fuse had been lit. Applause erupted, loud, sustained. Someone shouted, about time. Another person called out, give the man his fines back. Even the city engineer standing in the corner nodded subtly, as if the verdict had been passed. Everett raised his hands, trying to calm the room. The board will hold an emergency session to formally rescind all fines penalties. and notices related to the wall at 4241 West Ridgeview. We will also move to revise HOA policy to acknowledge and accommodate emergency structural mitigation work approved by the city. Furthermore, he paused, swallowing hard. We extend an apology to Mr. Callahan and his family. I didn't bow, didn't nod. I simply stepped back and said, "It's not me you should be apologizing to. It's the neighborhood." And then I sat down. The rest of the meeting blurred together. Announcements, damage control, promises of policy review. Karen's name never came up again. The empty chair stayed that way for the full 90 minutes. But it wasn't just a chair. It was a monument to the silence that follows arrogance, to the reckoning that comes when authority is exposed by truth. After the meeting, people approached me like I was some local hero. A few tried to take selfies. One man offered to buy me a beer. Another woman said her son was inspired by how I stood up to the system. But I didn't feel heroic. I felt tired. Not from the storm, not from the fight, but from everything it cost just to be heard. Sophie tugged at my sleeve as we walked out. "Can we go home now?" I looked at her, her face calm, her hair a little wild, her boots still speckled with mud, and smiled. "Yeah," I said, "let's go home." And we did. Past the clubhouse, past the cleanup trucks, past the signs that had once warned me I was in violation. Back to our house, the one that still stood. Because I did. The rain stopped 3 days after the slide. The sky opened slowly, reluctantly, like it wasn't sure whether it was done punishing us. But eventually, the clouds gave way to a dim autumn sun, and with it came the hush that always follows chaos. Birds returned. The smell of wet cedar and mud softened into something more familiar. And for the first time in months, Fair Hollow Ridge felt quiet. The cleanup crews stayed busy, of course. Trucks rolled through every morning, scraping mud from the streets, hauling off debris in clanging metal bins. Power lines were repaired. Sidewalks re-leveled. FEMA stopped by to assess slope stability. I spoke to the geotech team again just to confirm what I already knew. My wall had shifted 1.2 inches under 6 tons of pressure. That was all. The engineer grinned and said, "It'll outlast most of the homes here." That was the last professional opinion I needed. The city mailed me a letter 1 week later, an official commendation for preventative action taken to protect public safety and adjacent properties. The mayor even signed it. I didn't hang it up. Just tucked it into the same folder that once held cease and desist orders, lien threats, and fine breakdowns. A different kind of record now. Karen was gone. Not just from the board, but from the neighborhood. Her house went on the market 3 weeks after the storm. Charming 3-bedroom with mountain views, the listing said. No mention of the mud line that stopped inches from her deck. No mention of the wall she once called an eyesore. I watched the movers from my front porch, half a dozen guys in blue uniforms, hauling furniture into a truck, while a realtor made notes on a clipboard. I never saw Karen come out. She must have slipped away sometime in the early morning, like a rumor drying up in the sun. I didn't feel vindicated watching her go. I just felt relieved. Because the fight was over. Not just the legal battle. Not just the public shame or the HOA bureaucracy, or the storm itself. The fight for my home. For the right to protect it, to stand by it, to fortify it without apology was over. And I'd won. But the wall was what won me back. Sophie and I stood out there the weekend after they cleared the mud rake in hand, shoveling the last of the dried sediment off the gravel path. She wore the same little boots she had on during the storm, though now they were clean, the yellow rubber shining under the sun. "Daddy," she said, placing a hand against the wooden slats. "Can we paint it?" I raised an eyebrow. "Paint the wall?" "Yeah," she smiled. "It's kind of famous now." I laughed. Famous walls usually don't get painted. They just stand. But she looked at me the way only a daughter can. Still, I think it should be pretty too. So we did. We spent the whole Sunday painting one side of the wall. Just us, a couple of brushes, and some leftover exterior paint from the garage. I let her choose the color, something close to moss green with a stripe of sky blue near the top. When we were done, I carved a single word into one of the beams with my old utility knife. Not big, not flashy. Just one word. Stood. Because that's what it did. That's what all weeks did. The HOA eventually held another vote to revise the CC&Rs. They added an emergency mitigation clause, just like I asked. They also passed new language requiring city permits to be respected by default, no HOA override. It didn't make headlines, it didn't come with a speech, but it was on paper, and that's what mattered. Some neighbors still don't speak to me. That's fine. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to raise my daughter, to protect the land I worked my whole life for, to keep our home standing. And when the next storm comes, and it will, I won't be afraid, because I know what we built. Not just the retaining wall, but everything it stood for. Strength, conviction, patience, and truth. I still sit out on the deck some mornings, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise crest over the ridge. The slope looks different now, scarred but healing, like it remembers, like it respects what tried to bury it and what refused to fall. Sometimes Sophie joins me, snuggling beside me under a blanket. "Daddy," she said once, "do you think the wall missed the storm?" I looked out at the soaked grain, the mud still clinging to its sides, the timber faded and proud. "No," I said, smiling. "I think it was waiting for it. Because some things are meant to stand, even when everything else comes down around them. Especially then."